Today we're going to look at the first half of section 1-1, Doing Science. We will cover the scientific method, the types of experiments, and variables. But first off, what is chemistry? Chemistry is the study of matter and its interactions and changes, how it reacts, how it mixes, etc. And we're investigating the mixing or the changing of matter. So what's matter? Matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. So even air, which we can't see or feel or smell, has mass because it's matter. If we took a balloon and weighed it before and after we blew it up, before we blew it up, the balloon would weigh less because after we've blown the balloon up, we've put air or matter, more matter into the balloon, so it's going to have more mass. I'm just going to briefly go over the scientific method. The main thing I want you to know about the scientific method is there's no one scientific method. There are steps that are common to all the scientific methods, but every scientist, or even different types of scientists, might do the scientific method a little bit differently. They all tend to start out the same, by observing something and having a question. Once you have a question, then you can gather the data. In chemistry, most data gathering is done by experimentation. In other sciences, for example biology, field studies might be important. Biologists might want to examine the habitat of mallard ducks, so they go to Winton Woods to observe where the ducks like to hang out and for how long. Long-term observations become important in medical science. For example, is this new drug really effective at curing cancer or stopping a cancer tumor from growing? Once the data has been gathered, then the data would be analyzed and the conclusions would be drawn. Now, there's not one linear cycle to this. So a scientist might start by observing, do an experiment, analyze the data, say, well, that's kind of weird, I want to change some stuff, I'm going to go back and do the experiment again. Analyze the data again. This could go on for several steps until they go and draw conclusions. Then once scientists draw conclusions, they really want to communicate their findings, share them with other people in the scientific community and the public. There are different ways to do this. The most prestigious is the first listed, the journal article. Articles aren't published just anywhere. Anybody can publish on the internet. But to get in a peer-reviewed journal, you have to write up your research, and then other experts in your field look at your paper that you've written and critique it. They'll give you feedback. Do you need to change some things? Did you forget about this influence? Maybe you want to look at that effect type of thing. It takes a while for the article to actually get accepted. So once it gets accepted, it's sound science and it's carries great weight. It's very prestigious. In between steps to getting an article published, scientists might communicate findings by attending conferences. A conference is where you'll go and present an oral talk on your research so far and get feedback and maybe ideas for what to do when you get back in the lab. Poster sessions are the same type of thing, and they happen at conferences, but they're not as formal as giving an actual speaking presentation. In a poster session, you design and lay out all your research onto a poster. It includes your results and your conclusions, and then it's displayed for others to look at. And oftentimes the researcher is standing there ready to ask questions and get feedback. So as the book says, science is loopy or circular. It doesn't follow a linear path. It goes back and forth and around in circles and such. There's no one path that it's going to follow. In this class, we're going to look at two types of experiments. The first is where we're going to identify relationships or effects. That one variable has on another. I'll talk about what a variable is in a minute. So for example, how does volume affect pressure? Or how does a reaction rate change with the temperature? So I want you to take a few moments and come up with a third example of this type of experiment now. Okay, my example that I came up with is how does stirring affect reaction rate? There are many different kinds of examples, unlimited in fact, that you could have come up with. If you have a question, just ask in class. The second type of experiment we'll look at is where we determine a specific quantity or fact. So what is the value of the gas law constant? What is the concentration of the salt solution? For a fact example, maybe we want to determine, does this reaction occur in the presence of light? Yes or no? In this case, there's no relationship, there's no effect we're studying, just what's the number, or is this true? So there's no variables or constants to worry about when planning out your experiment. Okay, so I've mentioned a variable a couple times. What is a variable? A variable is a parameter that changes during the experiment, and there are two types. The first type we're going to talk about is an independent variable. It's controlled by you. You decide how to change it. Oftentimes this is also called the manipulated variable. The other type of variable is a dependent variable. It's the variable that you measure or you observe. You don't affect the variable, you just observe it happening. So for example, does exposure to sunlight have an effect on the speed of the reaction? Which is the independent, which is the dependent variable? Well, first you want to identify your two variables. So the first is exposure to sunlight. The second variable is the speed of the reaction. Next, to identify the independent variable, you want to look at which one would be easiest for you to change. The actual exposure to sunlight or how fast the reaction's occurring. It's going to be easier to change whether the reaction's exposed to sunlight. So that's the independent variable. Speed of the reaction is what you would just sit back and observe. So that's going to be the dependent variable. I want you to take a few moments and try to identify the independent and dependent variable on this next example. How does reaction rate change with temperature? So take a few moments and determine this now. Okay, so hopefully you first identified the variables. So one variable is the reaction rate, the other variable is the temperature. Next, to figure out the independent variable, determine which variable is going to be most easy for you to change, reaction rate or temperature. You're going to be able to change the temperature. So temperature is the independent variable, and reaction rate is the dependent variable. I don't want you to get into the habit of thinking whichever's listed first is independent, because these two examples show that's not true. Okay, the next example is tricky. What's the concentration of the salt solution? Okay, so first you want to identify the variables present. Take a moment to do that. Okay, and you probably noticed concentration's a variable, but you may have had a hard time figuring out the second variable. That's because there isn't one. I told you it was tricky. Because there's only one variable listed, we can't identify the independent and dependent variable. This is the second type of experiment I talked about, where we're determining an actual quantity, the concentration. So we don't have independent and dependent variables. It's not applicable. That ends this lecture for today. Make sure you write down any questions you had or difficulties, and be sure to ask them in class. Thanks.